December 7th, 1941. Many Americans remember this tragic day as the day the enemy, Japan, bombed Pearl Harbor during World War II. The consequences of this day extend beyond the hundreds of American soldiers who were killed. Because of this single act, thousands of American citizens were thrown into internment camps for an unpredicted amount of time. As days in internment camps continued for these evacuees, constitutional and political debates were occurring among citizens, leaders, and Congress. One historian even described this debate on resettlement as Seattle's greatest racial problem during World War II. The bombing at Pearl Harbor was not a random, irrational act done by the Japanese. For some time, there had been growing tension between the U.S. and Japan. The U.S. had started to fear Japan because of the aggression they showed in invading Manchuria, northern China. The United States' alarm grew when in September of 1940, Japan allied with Germany and Italy, calling themselves the Axis powers. Germany, at the time, had been thought of as unstoppable because they had quickly and easily conquered Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and France. The United States opposed Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia. When the Japanese troops occupied northern Indochina, U.S. cut off important exports to Japan. Japan relied heavily on oil, scrap metal, and other raw materials from the United States. Tensions between the two countries rose. Japan seized the rest of Indochina in 1941, and President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in U.S. banks. These events put together resulted in the bombing at Pearl Harbor. Therefore, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, some Americans directed their rage at people of Japanese ancestry. In February of 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed and issued Executive Order 9066, which authorized the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry from the west coast of the United States. By the end of 1942, almost all Japanese Americans on the west coast were in internment camps. 70% of the 110,000 men, women, and children were American citizens. The internment of persons of Japanese ancestry during World War II was an obvious contravention of the Constitution, and it sparked political and constitutional debates among citizens, leaders, and non-Japanese alike. The internment of Japanese Americans seemed promising during World War II, but ultimately it resulted in consequences, such as the Civil Liberties Act. There were two opinions formed on the constitutionality of the internment camps: those who believed the camps were a violation of constitutional rights, and those who either denied the fact that it broke the Constitution or ignored it altogether. Gordon Hirabayashi was a Nisei, born and raised in Seattle. He went to the University of Washington and was a major believer in social action and pacifism. In May of 1942, he decided it was not right that as a person of Japanese descent, he had to be put on a curfew. After purposely breaking curfew, he turned himself into the FBI and was sentenced to 90 days in jail, before finally having his case reach the Supreme Court in 1943. According to Hirabayashi, the judge at his trial said to the jury, "You heard all this discussion about the Constitution and all that. That's irrelevant. Whatever the Constitution says, the thing that you must take into consideration is that Executive Order 9066 is issued by the general in charge. Now you're to determine to what extent this is applied. Is this person of Japanese ancestry? If he is, did he comply with these restrictions? If he didn't, you must come back with a guilty verdict. If he did, then he's not guilty." Hirabayashi lost the case. Fred Korematsu had a similar problem to Hirabayashi. Korematsu was a Japanese American that did not want to leave his home in San Leandro, California, for internment camps. After being rejected from the army, he managed to get plastic surgery, hide under a different name, and work as a welder, until he was found on May 30th, 1942. In 1944, his case was brought before the Supreme Court. Ultimately, the court accepted the United States military's argument that some Japanese and Japanese Americans were loyal to Japan. Justice Robert Jackson reluctantly admitted that because it was a time of war, the military would maintain the power to arrest citizens. Justice Jackson also stated that the judicial branch had no executive power, so they could not really do anything about this problem. Nevertheless, Justice Jackson believed that the nation's wartime security concerns were not serious enough to strip Korematsu and other internees of their constitutional rights. He said, "A military order, however unconstitutional, is not apt to last longer than the military emergency. But once a judicial opinion rationalizes such an order that it conforms to the Constitution, or rather rationalizes the Constitution to show that the Constitution sanctioned such an order, the court for all of time has validated the principle of racial discrimination. Hirabayashi and Korematsu are two of the various people who stood up for the Japanese Americans by arguing the unconstitutionality of the camps. However, people like the Army General in charge of wartime security on the West Coast, John L. DeWitt, thought otherwise. He stated, "A Jap's a Jap. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen. Theoretically, he is still Japanese and you can't change him." DeWitt shows pure ignorance towards the law and the Constitution. Governor Arthur Langley, who was an anti-Japanese like DeWitt, was also a former Seattle mayor from 1938 to 1941. He wanted an amendment to the Constitution that made sure no more Japanese could become citizens of the United States. In addition to constitutional debate, political debates were occurring up and down the West Coast. For instance, anti-Japanese groups like the local Seattle Teamsters Union and the Remember Pearl Harbor League, made up of Auburn Valley farmers, did not support the Japanese. The leader of the Teamsters Union, Dave Beck, stated that Teamsters are campaigning to banish Japanese for the entire Pacific Coast. The Remember Pearl Harbor League, similar to the Teamsters, said that the Japanese were a menace until removed and will become a menace again when returned. The Japs must not come back to the West Coast. However, there were also pro-Japanese groups that supported Japanese Americans' rights. Leland Burroughs, the acting director of the United States government's War Relocation Authority, was one of these people, and she complained about the Teamsters' widespread attempt to drive these people from employment in the produce business. Another pro-Japanese, defense worker R.S. Bixby, stated that the Remember Pearl Harbor League was cowardly, selfish, and guilty of fomenting racial hatred. The Japanese Americans may have seemed frightening to the non-Japanese, but the truth was that the Japanese Americans should have been protected from internment camps by the Constitution. The internment camps and the internment camp debate affected many events nationwide. After the war ended, the image of the Asian American had completely changed for multiple reasons. By 1952, years after the Japanese had resettled, all legal discrimination was removed. One of the biggest changes in this was that Asian immigrants, including the Japanese, had the same naturalization rights as other groups. There had also been a huge increase in the number of Asians in America. This helped change the Japanese Americans' image because there was a less racist climate in general. On top of this, in 1960, a neoconservative scientist, William Peterson, described the Japanese Americans as a model minority. This later caught on, and the headline in a 1982 Newsweek said Asian Americans, a model minority. However, multiple failures resulted as well. The West Coast community broke into different groups, depending on their opinions, causing many communities to fall apart. Also, because there is still so much racism, most Japanese Americans faced violence, vandalism to their property, and segregation. The Japanese Americans lost priceless items, hard work, and a chunk of their lives that no amount of money could make up. Chiyo Takeshita, an internee, stated that the small reparations her family was given only made up a quarter of what they lost. She says that she felt so sorry for her parents. They had worked so hard to build their lives in America, and then had lost it all. Tragic consequences resulted because of this debate. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was passed, and the government apologized and gave $20,000 of reparation money to every survivor of the concentration camps. This act was a success for the internees, but a failure for the United States government because they lost money. In addition, because of this debate, thousands of Japanese Americans lost their personal belongings in their old lives. In the post-war years, the Japanese struggled to rebuild their lives under the icy glares of the non-Japanese. The effects of this debate show up in some recent events as well. Frank H. Wu, the dean of the Wayne State University Law School, says that there is a connection between internment camps after Pearl Harbor and the growing support of racial and ethnic profiling, such as the repercussions of the attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. He states, "The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is the obvious precedent of the treatment of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans in the aftermath of September 11, 2000 terrorist attacks." Today, the influence of Japanese culture is everywhere in America. Foreign foods, clothes, and art show up in stores and cities around the country and world. Unfortunately, the Japanese internment argument will be a debate that stains American history for years to come.